I'm Dr. Tasia White, and you're listening to Things My Boss Never Told Me. Hello, and welcome to episode number 9 of Things My Boss Never Told Me. I am your gracious host, Dr. Tasia White, and I am excited for us to wrap up this segment on teams. So if you've been following along in episodes 7 and 8, I talked about the 6 key components to establishing a team dynamic, and it was very much based in a lot of leadership theories as well as some of my own personal experiences, and my intention was to provide a framework for establishing cohesive teams, right? And in this episode, we're going to take a slightly different approach and specifically talk about team development. And I've decided to call this episode the 12 Tips for Team Development because there are 12 examples of how I personally developed my teams over the years. And I'll be completely honest, this is totally anecdotal. Today, I'm not really going to talk about any research, at least not something that hasn't been previously mentioned. And it's really about me sharing some really great stories about things that I have either done or have seen other people do in terms of developing their teams, right? And so in today's episode, I'm going to share some formal as well as informal strategies that I found to be helpful in terms of developing my own team. And some of these strategies were intentional and some of them were totally by happenstance, to be completely frank. So if anything, I really wanted to keep this episode a little bit lighter in comparison to our last 2 episodes, because I feel like there was a lot of information thrown at all of you listening, right? And I totally get it. So understand that the 12 tips that I'm going to share today are focused more on the fun side of team development. So I hope that you enjoy it, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first of the 12 tips starts with something that I'll be honest, you can't really do, right? It has to be something that has to build organically, but something that will really help the team overall. And that is to have some inside jokes. I think about just all of the different teams that I've worked with and, the little things that we can say to each other and just instantly start laughing, or, the different phrases or things that will trigger a specific memory. And if you are in an environment where things can get a little hectic and crazy at times, having inside jokes can really, really help to lighten the mood. I think I shared this in a previous episode, but one of the things that I always put in a position description, and I'll admit I got this from one of my supervisors, but in every position description, it said, must have a good sense of humor. Just because of the craziness that we dealt with and the frequency of that craziness, and just recognizing that sometimes humor can really help to ease the mood, right? And so one of my favorite inside jokes, particularly with one of my interns that I had a few years ago, who's now one of my really good friends. But at the time, she was just starting to work with me. And as we were sort of developing this supervisor-supervisee relationship, there were these little things that would happen around the office. And the two of us would just look at each other and just start laughing. To this day, either I will say something or she will say something, and we'll look at each other and just start laughing. But that started when she was my intern, and trying to navigate all of the hustle and bustle in my office, there was nothing that we can do except laugh, right? Just because of some of the ridiculous scenarios that were presented to us. And so whenever I said office shenanigans, she and I would just start laughing because we understood office shenanigans as our inside joke. Finding the humor in the little things that transpired in my office or in my department. So inside jokes can really go a long way. All right, number 2, Superlative Awards. Now, this was something that I learned about sometime in college. I can't remember where exactly, but in one of the things that I was involved in college, which was a lot, we gave out paper plate awards, and they were essentially just these silly awards that we gave to each other or that our supervisors gave to us that highlighted something that took place that year. And so that's something that I decided to continue as a tradition because I thought it was a lot of fun. And so with my first team, we did paper plate awards and they had no idea what they were. And so I made them these little awards at the end of the year, just highlighting different things that I appreciated about them at the end of the year. And then as I continued to introduce the idea of paper plate awards to other teams that I was working with, the awards became a little bit funnier, a little bit more silly, not so much focused on like anything of significance. It was really just meant to be something funny, right? And at one of my jobs, we would actually give out these awards at our awards dinner at the end of the year. And so we had some very serious awards that we gave out. But then we would also take some time to give out these superlative awards so that no one left empty-handed, right? Totally a millennial thing, but that's okay. And again, it was just something fun. And what I appreciated about the superlative awards is that it helped me to kind of recap some of the different milestones or some of the significant moments that occurred that year and then focused on that for an award. So for example, I've talked about my associate director multiple times on this podcast, and she was just great to work with. And one of the things that I appreciated about her is that she had everything. Like whatever you needed, she had it in her office. One time I needed a pair of socks and she was like, here you go. And I'm like, why do you have socks in your office? And she's like, I don't know. You never know. And so because of her resourcefulness, I gave her the Inspector Gadget Award. And she just had everything. Like whatever we needed, she either had it or knew someone who had it. Again, it was just meant to be something funny, something light. I still have some of my superlative awards that I received over the years just because of how funny they were. So if nothing else, they are great reminders of just some of the fun experiences that I've had over the years. All right, tip number 3, group chat. So this is something that, with all of the new technology, and I say that in air quotes because it's not really new, but the expectations around work and connecting via these technological tools has changed over the years, right? And so before it was just about email, and if you had a BlackBerry, checking emails on your phone, and then from the days of having BlackBerries to now pretty much every smartphone giving you access to emails, there has been a shift in terms of how much we use said smartphones for work, right? And one of the things that I kind of resisted for a while was having a group chat because for me, I wanted to have a work-life balance and I wanted to encourage my team to do the same. And I think I shared previously that for many of my team members, they lived where they worked. So having that barrier was important for me. However, for them, it was a helpful tool. And so with that in mind, I've made sure to set some ground rules in terms of what should and should not be included in the group chat, right? Because ideally, for me at least, I saw it as an opportunity to quickly share some tidbits of information like a reminder or a heads up or, hey, can you check your email? And not another avenue for sending something that could be put in an email, right? And so I was very intentional about what I included in the group chat because I didn't want that to become our main line of communication after hours. So having those ground rules were important for me and emphasizing that this is not to be a substitute for emails. So whatever it is that you have to say, if it's more than a few sentences, just send the email and send a text message saying, hey, can you check this email? For the most part, I found my teams to be very respectful of that, right? Because at the end of the day, they also didn't want to be attached to their phones after hours anyway. So I found it to be just a great tool to keep us in the loop And I will say, after agreeing to have some kind of group chat, I did find it to be helpful, especially in situations where I needed to remind my staff about something that was coming up. So for example, if we had a meeting with my supervisor or with other people on campus, I would put a little message in the group chat saying, hey, don't forget the so-and-so meeting at blah, 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 versus going into my email and typing that same message. And who's to say that they're going to read said email in time for the meeting? So ultimately, I did see the value in having a group chat. If that's something that you don't already have, perhaps you will find value in that as well. But I definitely recommend setting some ground rules so that, again, it does not become a substitute for emails. Okay, tip number 4. This is something that I've already talked about, but I figured why not bring it back here? This was specifically talked about in episode number 4, where we talked about mindful leadership, and I shared the roses and thorns activity that I would typically do with my teams at the end of each meeting. And this was an activity I actually took from one of my previous supervisors. Well, she didn't call it roses and thorns. I personally just liked calling it roses and thorns, but I forget what she called it. Nonetheless, it was the same activity where we would share something positive happening in our life and maybe something not so positive happening in our life. And as I shared in episode number 4, I really found this activity to be insightful for me as the leader to get a sense for what is happening in my team's lives, what is happening for them personally, and letting them know that it's a safe space for them to share that amongst our team members. And obviously it was up to them to decide how personal they wanted to be with their sharing. But nonetheless, I found value in terms of understanding what was happening with them. And I believe my team found it to be valuable for the same reason, right? So if someone seemed a little bit off, they could think back to what was shared at the meeting and check in with them a little bit later. And I'll admit, Roses and Thorns is probably one of my favorite activities I did with my teams because it just allowed for more interpersonal connections. And that's really what I thrive on, is having these authentic connections. And so for me, it was an opportunity to maybe privately ask them about the thing that they mentioned in the staff meeting, like, how was your cousin's baby shower? Or how is your grandmother doing? And it really helped to just create a better connection with me and my teams, but also within the team as a whole. And I will admit, there were a few staff members who apparently during our staff meetings, they just didn't have any roses to share. And so one of my Superlative Awards very early in my career was the No Roses Award. And so what I did was I drew a vase with a bunch of rose stems that just had thorns on them. And like the roses were sitting around the vase because they were no longer attached. I'm sure you get the concept. And I'm realizing that I forgot to mention with the Superlative Awards, one of the things I appreciated about doing those was the fact that I got to be a little bit creative in terms of depicting something that accurately explained what the award meant. And as someone who loves to do arts and crafts, as you can imagine, doing these paper plate awards gave me the opportunity to really express my creativity in a way that I wasn't able to do normally. All right, so back to our list. Tip number 5. And this is another activity I mentioned in the same episode. So no surprise here, but it's a 3 flags activity. And since I've talked about it multiple times, I'm not going to re-explain it, but just know that it is a really insightful and empowering tool for teams because it gives them the opportunity to let their fellow team members know like what's okay and what's not okay, what's going to empower them and what's going to piss them off, and what may trigger them if something comes up. So it's just a really informative activity to do with our team. All right, tip number 6, going to happy hour. Now, this was something that I did a few times a semester because it was just a nice way for us to get out of the office and be a little bit casual with each other, right? Granted, we had a very casual office dynamic anyway, so that wasn't much of a stretch, but it just gave us a change of scenery, which was pretty cool. And it's funny, there was a book that I was reading, actually, I believe I talked about it in the first episode, The Buddha Good and the Badass, and I talked about it being a book for spiritual entrepreneurs. And the author of this book is actually the founder of Mindvalley, which is a massive personal development platform that just has a lot of really cool workshop, podcast, and courses, but not like your traditional kind of courses, like ones that really cater to personal development. And one of the things that he talked about in his book was that he found happy hour to be a great opportunity for his newer or younger employees to interact with him outside of the office. And so with him having such a busy schedule, he wasn't always able to meet with said employees formally. However, the happy hours were an opportunity to have some more informal conversations. And with a little bit of liquid courage, these newer employees or interns would share their ideas on how to improve a system or how to change something that was significant to the company. And he appreciated having those conversations with those employees because obviously it gave him some new ideas for improving the company, but it also gave them an opportunity to share that and then essentially take the lead on said idea. And so having some kind of happy hour, whether it be once a month or a few times a year, can really be helpful for many reasons. So in my case, it was just more so for us to have some casual time outside of the office. However, in the case of the founder of Mindvalley, it was an opportunity for him to hear from his newer employees that maybe didn't have direct access to him, who had great ideas for making the company and the products that they were offering better. And who wouldn't want to have that, right? Especially if there's a concern of sharing these ideas with a supervisor and then having said ideas stolen from them. Now, granted, I don't know if that happened at his company, but I could see how that would be present in other kind of corporate settings. So doing some kind of happy hour, something to consider, okay? All right, tip number 7, and this kind of goes along the lines of happy hour, but it's planning some kind of office outing. And so it doesn't necessarily have to include alcohol if that's something that isn't appropriate for your work environment, but it should be something that is interactive, right? So planning an office outing to the movies, probably not the best idea. However, planning an office outing to, let's say, bowling, that is a wonderful idea. And that's actually something that I did with a few of my teams over the years, especially with my student staff, at least once a year. And just logistically, it was not easy for me per se. However, it was still a wonderful activity because it was fun. It got people a little bit competitive. It sort of forced people to be a little bit vulnerable if they didn't necessarily know how to bowl and they had to use like the bumper. And it ultimately helped to build some camaraderie. Like literally at the end of each of those bowling outings, like everyone just left like really, really happy and excited. Like they had a really great time. So I highly recommend doing some kind of office outing that is interactive. Maybe doing some kind of sporting activity, although it's important to keep everyone's skill level in mind. And I guess that's one of the things I really enjoyed about bowling. It didn't matter if you were good at it or not. You were just having fun at the end of the day, right? So finding some other activity like that can really help in terms of developing your team. All right, tip number 8, high and low rope activities. So if you have the resources available to you, whether it be access to a ropes course and the finances to pay for it, I highly recommend it, especially if you are someone who doesn't necessarily want to be the facilitator of the team development activities, because so far, the tips that I have mentioned are centered around you, the supervisor, being the one to facilitate this, right? And so if you want to maybe take a step back, having your team participate in some kind of ropes course can really go a long way. Although I'm one who doesn't necessarily like high ropes courses because personally, I'm afraid of heights. So it was really scary for me to do said activities. And so I really thrived in the low ropes activities and was happy to participate in those. But again, it was just a nice opportunity to have someone else facilitate some activities to get all of us connected. And for the high ropes activities, I was just more of a cheerleader, cheering them on, letting them know that they were great, and just expressing my appreciation for them participating in said activities, right? I will share this one story. So my first year as the director of my department at my alma mater, we planned a high ropes trip for our student staff. And this was my first real interaction with them as their new director. And so I felt a little bit of pressure to participate in said activities because I'm the leader. I want to make sure that I lead by example. However, I did challenge myself that day. So the entire course involved like moving around these pillars and ropes around a square, and I'm just there cheering everyone from down below along with two of my other staff members who also were not fond of high ropes courses. So, we're cheering them on, and at the end of the entire course, they had the option to either zip line or do like a parachute drop from the starting point. And so they ended where they essentially started, right? And so each one is choosing which one they wanted to do, whether it was the zip line or the like bungee drop. And so I'm watching all of them and I'm cheering them on. And I was like, all right, guys, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this last part. Like I couldn't do the other thing because you would have seen me crying and embarrassing myself. However, I will do the zip line. And so they were like really excited. And so I put on the harness and I start to climb up this tower and I start to question whether or not this is a good idea. And so I'm like looking down and seeing that I'm really high up, and I'm looking up and seeing that I still have quite a bit to go. And I start to get nervous and shaky, and they start to cheer me on. They're like, come on, Tasia, you can do it. You can do it. Come on, you can do it. And I'm like, all right. And so they cheered me all the way up the tower. And once I was up there, I was fine. But it was just the fact that I had to climb up there that really freaked me out. And so, everyone is excited that I made it to the top, and then they're excited for me to like zip down. And so after taking a few deep breaths, I went ahead and leaped and was right back where I started. So for me, it was just really cool to have their encouragement, right? Because although I'm the one who was supposed to be the fearless leader in that instance, I was not fearless. I was very fearful. But I appreciated having them be the cheerleaders and supporting me, challenging myself. And I wouldn't say I overcame my fear because I still don't like high ropes courses, but I did at least step out of my comfort zone. And I really think that helped me to build some credibility with them because I wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. I wasn't afraid to share my phobia of heights and ultimately step outside of my comfort zone. So if you are someone who are also afraid of heights, then maybe stick with the low ropes. In fact, when we went back to the ropes course a few years later, we only did the low ropes course. So that was fun, for me at least. All right, so that brings us to tip number 9, which is personality quizzes and or performance assessment. So I believe I previously talked about the Clifton strengths and how I use that to understand my strength, but I also had my entire team, including my student staff, participate in the Clifton Strength Assessment. And so if you're unfamiliar with the Clifton Strengths Assessment, you essentially answer a series of questions. Like I think it's like 50 questions, maybe it's 100 questions, I don't remember. And the idea is to answer them as quickly as possible. Not that it's timed, but the idea is to get your immediate reaction so that you don't necessarily have a whole lot of time to overthink your answer to the prompt or the question. It was mostly a prompt. And so they had you choose one word or another or something in the middle. And by the end of it, they tell you what your top 5 out of like 30 something, I think it's like 34 strengths. They tell you what your top 5 are unless you purchase the extended one where it ranks all 30 plus strengths from your top 5, your top 10, and then whatever follows that. And what I found is doing the Clifton Strengths assessment with my entire team, like my entire department, really was a bonding experience. So for me, I saw it as an opportunity to just get a sense for what everyone's strengths are, right? To get a sense for who would be good at what and who we could tap into for specific tasks or projects, right? However, the thing I wasn't anticipating was various staff members bonding over their top 5 strengths. And so if there were some individuals who had similar ones, that became a conversation point. And so throughout that entire training, the year that we did the Clifton Strengths, that was the focal point, which again, I wasn't anticipating, but it was really cool to kind of see that happen organically, right? Because they were able to connect with each other in a way that just didn't exist in the past. I just felt like they took it more seriously, and they had some really significant conversations around the Clifton Strengths, which I found to be very intriguing. So it gave us something new to bond over ultimately. But prior to doing the Clifton Strengths, there were other quizzes that I did that were intentional. For example, there was one quiz that I found that specifically spoke to one's communication pattern. And I always did that one during our training, particularly if I had a new staff, so that we could understand like everyone's communication style, right? And there was another quiz that I did during the transition that took place my last year, where my staff was working with a new supervisor, and I facilitated this activity so that they could understand each other's work values. And the idea was to make the transition a little bit smoother for everyone, because there was just a lot of angst around the transition overall, especially because of the timing of it. But nonetheless, the work values activity really helped their new supervisor to understand where they were coming from and what they needed to feel supported. So I share all of this to say personality quizzes or performance assessments can really be a helpful tool for team development. So something that I would highly recommend. And there are several of them that are actually free for you to download or free for you to take, and you can download the results. And if I can find the link to that website that listed them for free, I will make sure to include that on my website. All right? Okay, so tip number 10, retreats. Now, I know that there are certain people who completely loathe the idea of having to spend time with their colleague somewhere else overnight. However, if they can just put that aside, there really is an opportunity for something great to develop, because you're getting out of the office, away from the distractions within the office, and really focusing on what is happening right in front of you. Because let's be real, how many people are really paying attention in a staff meeting or strategic planning meeting if it's being held in their office? You're likely to have people on their email, coming in and out of the room, going to other meetings and then returning to them, and that's really taking away from what it is that you may be trying to create, right? And so what I have found is that retreats are great for big projects or strategic planning. And so I think about when I worked in upstate New York, and the vice president of our division would always plan a retreat at the end of the academic year. And it was literally a day or two after graduation that she would host this retreat, and she would take her direct reports out to a cabin that was an hour or so away, and they would stay there for a couple of days, and they would do the strategic planning for the next academic year. And so she found it to be helpful to just do that at the end of the academic year, i.e. right after graduation, because during the summer months, a lot of people would take vacation time, or some people might have had 10-month contracts. And so she needed to make sure that they were part of those meetings before they took their 2-month leave. And I adopted some version of this with my own teams. Now, granted, we didn't necessarily have the budget that she she did. So we couldn't necessarily go away for 3 days and do all of this planning. However, I did try to have at least one retreat a year with my teams. However, there was one year where we were launching a really big project. And before we could do that, I had to essentially get my team on board to do said project because it was very intricate. And what I had learned from conferences that I attended, as well as people that I connected with who had a similar project, I wanted to make sure that they had all of the tools to be able to facilitate said project. And I also wanted it to be something that they all had a hand in developing, because as I shared in the last 2 episodes, when you have your team members contributing to something significant, they're more likely to execute said project because they had a hand in developing it. And I will say in that case, we did not stay overnight because we just didn't have the resources to do so. However, we did utilize that day and really made the most of it. And it was really nice to get out of the office and really focus on this one project. And it was really cool because we started the day by making breakfast, and then we made lunch, and we took some time to also relax and take a break because I didn't want them to feel like they were being held captive at the end of the day. And it was a really nice place in terms of the scenery and all of the amenities. And so we balanced our work time with some relaxing time as well, which was really nice. Plus, I just found that being in that comfortable environment just made it easier to generate ideas and to be creative. Like, we went to a cabin just a few minutes away from campus. And so if you have access to these types of spaces, I highly recommend taking advantage of them and specifically saving them for those big projects or those big strategic planning meetings so that you could have some uninterrupted time for planning in a very comfortable environment, which opens up more lines of creativity because people are comfortable and in a more relaxing environment. All right, so that is tip number 10. Tip number 11, game night. So similar to bowling, game night is just another opportunity to get out of the office and do something fun that is interactive. It promotes competition in a fun and friendly way, depending on which game you're playing. And it builds camaraderie, right? Because who doesn't like to play a game? Okay, granted, some people may not like to play games, but most people do. And so if it's the right game, people will enjoy it, right? So when I was preparing for this episode, I was debating whether or not to share this story related to game night. And then I figured, why not? So one of the game nights that particularly stands out in my mind is one that actually happened informally. Like, it was totally spontaneous. We just decided to have an impromptu game night. However, what happened before the game night is what's really interesting. So this situation occurred way back, like probably in the middle of my higher education career. And I was an area coordinator and I was overseeing multiple buildings. Like, I think I had 6 buildings and 1,000 residents that I was responsible for. No pressure, right? And it was a weekend where a friend of mine was out of town and she asked me to dog sit for her. She had this really cute little dog. And so I was getting ready to leave campus because I wasn't on call for the weekend. And I was like, let me just go ahead over there and get settled and hang out with her dog and everything will be all right. And so as I am taking my stuff to the car, I notice one of my buildings has a fire alarm going off. Like, I can see the strobe light going off in the window. And I'm like, oh, that's not good. And so I go back into the building and check the fire panel to figure out where this fire, or so I thought, was coming from. And getting everybody out, at this point, the smoke detector starts to go off and people are exiting. And so getting people away from the building, allowing the fire department to come through, like, there was a process to all of this. And at this point, having been in that role for, I think it was my 3rd year. Yes. Having been in that role for 3 years, I had it all down to a science. And so I'm getting all of the students out, and I go back to the fire panel and I meet our campus security officers, and, we're trying to figure out what is happening. And so the fire department comes and gets us, and they're like, come in here and see what happened. And I walk into the building, and it was not a fire or smoke that set off the alarm. It was actually steam from our, wait for it, sprinkler system. So some lovely students decided to play tennis in the hallway, and one of them hit this little teeny tiny mechanism that is so small, it's about the size of a pin, but they hit that with the tennis ball, and that somehow set off the sprinkler system. And because of how that sprinkler system was set up, once that little pin is broken or moved, it automatically releases all of the water on that floor. So as we walk to the second floor, because that's where the pin was broken, and there is water everywhere, like in the stairwell, on the carpet, and seeping into student rooms, we are just amazed at what happened. By the time I was allowed to enter the building, the sprinkler was still going off, by the way. Like, there was still so much water that even after the fire department came and assessed everything, it had been at least 5 minutes at this point since we evacuated all of the students from the building. The sprinklers were still going off. It wasn't as much as when it initially went off, but it was still pouring water out of the ceiling. So nonetheless, it was going to be a long night. And again, I was not on call. However, since it was my building, I decided to stay and help with the cleanup and the reassigning, and because we had to relocate students, and some students just could not go back to their rooms because of how much water damage there was. And there was just so much that we had to do in terms of crisis management. Remember before I said that crisis management is something that I did a lot of? This is a prime example of that. So my colleague and I are doing whatever we can to relocate students to empty rooms, which we didn't have a lot of, but we did the best that we could, because essentially anyone who lived in that middle corridor, like it was a typical like long hallway, those who were closest to the center of that hallway were immediately impacted. Those at the end, a little bit, but not as much. And then those on the first floor, because of course the water had to go somewhere, were also impacted. And I would say on the first floor, it was mostly those that were directly under where the water initially started going off. But nonetheless, it was a lot. So 2 hours later, after we relocated everyone, worked with maintenance to try to get some wet vacs to get some of the water up, and the student who was responsible for triggering the alarm was nice enough to admit to us what happened. So that saved us a little bit of work, but it was just a very stressful time. And by the end of it, like, we were all exhausted. I still had not gone to my friend's house. And one of my students were like, hey, who wants to play Cards Against Humanity? And for those of you who are not familiar, around like 2010, this game called Cards Against Humanity was really, really popular. And a few of my staff members had the game because it was something that wasn't easily accessible. And I think at the time, like, it was on Amazon, but Amazon wasn't as big as what it is now. And so very few students had the game. And so we decided, why not? Let's just go ahead and play a couple rounds of Cards Against Humanity, because what else can you do after dealing with a flood, essentially? And I will say that really lightened the mood for the rest of the evening for all of us. And so if you think about how it started with us having to evacuate students, clean up water, relocate people, and make 1,000,001 phone calls to the dean and the associate dean and everyone who needed to know because of just the magnitude of this incident. sitting down and playing this game just made a world of a difference in terms of our mood that night, because many of us were annoyed and pissed off that we even had to deal with that. However, playing Cards Against Humanity just sort of wiped away all of that anger and frustration from our minds. So although that night started with a lot of drama, I would say the thing that really stood out to me, aside from, watching water pour from the ceiling in gallons, was us playing this game and laughing and joking and making light of what was a really sucky situation. So hopefully if you decide to do some game nights, it's not to ease some kind of frustration. Ideally, game nights should be something that's done intentionally for fun. However, I just felt the need to share that story because of, one, how ridiculous it was, and two, because at the end of the day, when I think about that scenario, I instantly think about us playing Cards Against Humanity in our office and just having a grand old time despite what happened 2 hours earlier. So yeah, there's that. All right, so last but not least, tip number 12. And this is something that I will admit a lot of people probably wouldn't feel comfortable doing for many reasons. However, I personally found this one to be probably the most impactful in terms of connecting with my team members and having them connect with each other. And I decided to save it for last because, again, it's something that probably is a little unconventional, right? And if you've been listening to all of the episodes, you know that I can be a little unconventional in terms of my leadership approach, right? So it should not be a surprise that I'm introducing yet another unconventional idea. And I guess, let me take that back. It's not that it's unconventional. It's more so that there are just people who are not comfortable doing it. And that's totally fine. For me, I didn't see an issue with it. All right, so let me not keep you guessing. So the 12th and final tip is opening your home. So for me, I actually enjoyed hosting. I enjoyed cooking and organizing my apartment in a way that was a little feng shui for the type of environment that I was trying to set, making it open for us to play games and to relax, enjoy some food, laugh. Very often we would play Just Dance in my apartment because I had the Just Dance game on my Wii. And that over time became my signature activity. We had a few game nights, but Just Dance, when we had the Just Dance nights, those were the fun nights because, again, it was just an opportunity for us to embarrass ourselves if we're not really good at dancing or really show off our dancing skills. And it's funny, I think about really early on when I started to do this with my teams, my colleagues came over and my colleague brought her husband and we found out that he was really good at Just Dance. We were all floored by how good he was at this dance. It's all right, clearly he's the expert here. We need to learn from him. And so it's just because of those types of interactions, you get to see people in a very different light. And when it's in someone's home, it's just more relaxed. At least that's what I found, right? And I was intentional about making sure other people felt relaxed. I didn't want anyone to feel like they were on eggshells. Don't put that glass on the table without a coaster. I wasn't really concerned about any of that. If anything, I just wanted to make sure that everyone was enjoying themselves, that they had some really good food, and that they were able to relax at the end of the day. And so one of the activities that I really enjoyed, aside from the Just Dance, was doing a paint and sip night at my apartment. So this is something I did my first year as a director. My apartment setup was a little bit different than I had in previous years, so I had to get really creative, but I essentially set up easels around my kitchen because that was the largest room in the house aside from my bedroom, and two, the only room that didn't have carpeting. And so we set up shop. We had a table with all of our paints in the middle of the kitchen and brushes and our beverages, and we just painted our favorite images, and we tried to at least have a theme where we painted like a similar image. Like even if it wasn't the exact same one, we had like different variations of the same image. And it was just really cool because one, we didn't really have access to like the paint and sip classes that would typically take place in the city. So we had to make our own. And we got really innovative and creative when we did it. So it was a very enjoyable activity. And I enjoyed hosting activities at my home for a few reasons. One of them being that it was typically the least expensive of the activities that I listed here, minus the Superlative Awards and things like that. But in terms of any other outing, it made it easier to budget for whatever it is that we were planning for that particular activity. And two, it gave a very comfortable space for us to hang out. And three, it gave my teams an opportunity to see me in my element, right? I feel like you get to know a lot about a person by seeing their home. And I wanted them to see that side of me. I wanted them to understand who I was as a person, not just who I was as their supervisor. And so hosting things at my home is just something that I just really, really enjoy doing. And I'll admit, I had very few supervisors who did the same. However, the ones who did, they just came across as being more personable and easy to connect with. And I wanted to make sure that I did the same for my teams because it really reiterated that whole concept of being a family, like I shared in episode number 8. So to me, inviting them into my home was just my way of letting them know that I meant what I said in terms of us being a family. And so that's it. Those are my top 12 tips for team development. I know some were more interesting than others, but I hope that there are at least a few techniques that you would feel comfortable implementing with your own teams. Okay? All right. So as always, we will transition to this episode's gratitude list. First, I am grateful for my teams being receptive to my team building tactics. As I mentioned a little bit ago, some of my tactics can be seen as a little unconventional. And for the most part, my teams didn't resist. Like they trusted me enough to participate in said activities. And I always tried to get their input. And for those on my team who were introverts, I made a point of making sure that one, we didn't do these activities all the time. And two, that it was something that everyone was comfortable with at the end of the day. So thank you all for indulging in said activities with me. Second, I am grateful for the experiences that I have had because of these activities. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, some of these activities I kind of discovered by happenstance, right? And so in those instances, I'm really glad that they worked out the way that they did. So I think back to the Clifton Strengths conversation where not realizing that doing that assessment would create more conversation between my student staff, like my entire department, that's something that I just did not anticipate. And that was really, really cool. Or even the encouragement that I received from my staff when I was afraid to climb up the tower. It's because of those experiences that really made everything that I did with my teams and for my teams worthwhile. I can certainly say that I learned a lot from each and every one of these activities. And so I hope that you also get to learn a lot from doing them too. Third, I am grateful for the great memories that I have acquired from these activities. There are so many memories that I just did not get a chance to talk about, but there are so many that come to mind whenever I think about any of the team development activities that I mentioned. And it just reminds me of just how much fun I had with my teams over the years. So very, very much grateful for the memories, including the one with the flood. All right, so now we will transition to this episode's affirmation. I care about the well-being of my team and take steps to facilitate team development. So in case you haven't noticed, the underlining theme in today's episode, as well as in episode 7 and 8, has been this idea of caring for our teams, being intentional about what we do for our teams and with our teams to make it cohesive, to make sure that we can operate in a way that is efficient and collaborative. And so I found that the best way to do that, at least do it well, is to really make sure that you actually care about the well-being of the people on your team, frankly. And if you care about their well-being, they will care about your well-being. So I wanted this episode's affirmation to kind of bring all of that together. All right, so I've really enjoyed recording this episode. I hope that you have enjoyed listening to it. And for episode number 10, which, by the way, I'm amazed that I'm even at episode number 10, but we're going to keep going. With episode number 10, I will specifically be talking about how to make your employees shine. All right? Well, as always, thank you so much for listening and have a great day. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Things My Boss Never Told Me. Before you go, please make sure that you like and subscribe down below. Also, I included a few recommended videos for you to check out. Thank me later.